Well, hello there, and welcome to another edition of Warbird Wednesday. My name is Fred Bell. I am the Vice Chairman of the Palm Springs Air Museum. I want to thank you for joining us. And today we are continuing on helicopters, and we've moved into the realm of a helicopter and a design that is so famous, pretty much everybody knows what this is. This is called the type the Huey. The production name was the Iroquois, but this one is the Huey, the UH-1. We're going to get into that, but first I want to recognize my abstruse assistant. Did I get it? He's nodding his head. My abstruse assistant, Greg Kenny, who, continues to really outdo himself in hats. The only challenge with this one is it is so small, Greg, that I am surprised I don't have an aneurysm. So I'm going to go ahead and take this. I think this is a squid. So there we go. I'm going to go ahead and remove the squid, and I'm going to toss it off camera to Greg. We're going to go ahead and get into this. Now, the Huey is a big step into a concept called air mobile. Now, you have to remember at the time that, we did the H-34, which the H-34 was okay, but it was not totally effective in combat. It had its limitations. It wasn't a great assault helicopter. The entire gunship concept had not been fleshed out yet. And we were getting into a hotter and hotter war in Southeast Asia. It became clear that if we were going to win there, and you have to remember, what was that old phrase, never start a land war in Asia, right? I think that was out of Princess Bride. The reality of the situation in Asia was, in Vietnam especially, was that the French had been fighting the falling dominoes, the dominoes of communism, and we'd been fighting these proxy wars. The French had fought a war in Vietnam and it had not done well at all, but they were trying to fight a traditional war. And the United States and the United States Army and Marines in particular were starting to toy with this concept of air mobile. Remember, in the old days, you either dropped parachute folks in, infantrymen with like C-47s or C-119, and they went in and parachutists went in. That didn't work in a country like Vietnam with that heavy canopy and jungle. And the other problem was, if you're going to fight your way up the roads or hold these bastions, the enemy knew that there was only so many ways in, and that's one of the challenges that the French had, in that they just could not effectively control the countryside and these redoubts, these areas that they had that they were trying to have as strong points, because it was incredibly difficult to resupply them. And so the French at Bien Dien Phu realized that they just couldn't manage the country. The United States was getting drawn increasingly in a historical context into fighting these dominoes of communism. Remember, we had already had Cuba in the Bay of Pigs, and we were fighting all of these wars with these proxy allies, both sides, in a very bipolar world, the Soviet Union and the United States. So enter an increasingly hot war in Vietnam and new and different equipment. We've covered fixed-wing aircraft already, but now we're going to get into these rotary-wing helicopters.
In the later years of the Vietnam War, helicopter missions became especially dangerous. The enemy's anti-aircraft fire was improving, and helicopters were vulnerable birds. The men who flew them were something special.
And I have two of the primary combatants behind me. On my right side, with the Falcon and the 335th, the Cowboys, is a UH-1B. I'm going to talk about each one of these helicopters specifically, because a lot of folks like us to cover the actual type that we have in inventory. And then I have a UH-1H model over my left shoulder. Now, the genesis of this helicopter wells all the way back to this Bell aircraft, to the XH-40, which was the prototype version in 1956. It was introduced in 1959. This type, the UH-1, was built in numbers from 1956 to 1987. Now, if you can believe this, Greg, there were 16,000 of these helicopters built, 7,000 deployed to Vietnam. They were also the Bell 204 and the Bell 205 in civilian registry, but they were quite effective. You could see big crew pilot, co-pilot area. They had a little cargo area behind. The primary difference between these helicopters was the length. The H was stretched and was called a slick. If it were in a medevac or in an infantry role, it could carry infantry. And the B model was shorter. Now, the power plant on this with these helicopters and getting into one of their big challenges was we had gone away from the Sikorsky had an 1820 radial engine in it to start. Now, an 1820 in context, Fred, fun fact, what was that, Greg? That was a B-17 engine, a radial engine, and it was, reciprocating. It ran on cylinders. What we ended up, and Greg can throw up the plan view of these helicopters, but I go out and get a turbine, a helicopter turbine, because now we're talking about a turbine. What's the difference? A lot more power in a smaller engine. What does that mean? It means less weight, right? Right? So you get more horsepower, more vroom. That's a technical term, Greg, vroom. You get more vroom, and that allows you to carry more people, to go further. The cruise speed on these was roughly about 100, 125 miles an hour, but you were dealing with turbines now. Now, what's the difference in the turbine? Really a couple of things. Like I talked about, more power, but also a much longer maintenance life in the turbine. A technical term, we're going to throw some jargon out here today, Greg, which is kind of fun. TBO, time before overhaul. When you go to a turbine, you have less maintenance and you have a much longer maintenance cycle that you have to pull that engine out and send it out to be rebuilt. So turbines were here to stay. They were going to replace radial or inline or V12 engines. Those were in the back going away. So essentially we're dealing with a jet turbine engine. Now, what are we talking about in terms of power? And those of you armchair folks at home, we're talking about anywhere in the B model, and the power went up from there from about 700 horsepower shaft horsepower, which Greg can go out and get you a graphic on that, to 1,400 horsepower on the shaft power. So that's what spun the rotor and what gave you the lift. Now, these aircraft continued to be lightly armored. And Greg, when he does his walk around, you can see they were broken into these two versions. The Bs, when they went into Vietnam and they started engaging combat, they realized, I'm going to go ahead and pick up my plan view here, they realized that they could not hold the countryside the way the French had originally done. And although the United States would continue to hold the cities and try to hold the major population center, the United States went on another version, and that was called, Greg, pacification. Pacification was to put fire bases and these little areas, pockets of troops, with out in the countryside, and to try to hold the countryside so they, from the north, they could stop the infiltration of supplies and equipment to the south, which either the Viet Cong or the NVA. That was the idea. It was extremely difficult to make happen in reality, but helicopters figured into that in a big way. So I've got my little mini version here, but I have two types. I've got that stretched, the slick with the bigger door, right, out there, and then I have my B model. Now, the B model became what was known as a hog, and a hog was essentially a gunship. So we had moved away. You kind of saw that clunky H-34 setup that Greg threw out last week, which was a gunship. We were starting to see some evolution, and the evolution revolved around miniguns in the doors, 2.75 rocket launchers, millimeter rocket launchers, 40 millimeter grenade launcher turret. And Greg can find a picture of that up in the front. The guys, the helicopters on these, a lot of guys would take in the front of the fuselage, they'd take a grease pencil and draw a pipper or a bullseye in the windscreen, and these things were essentially bore-sighted. Remember, we're not at a point where we have TOW missiles and things of that nature. We're going to talk about those in a minute. A TOW, which is essentially a wire-guided or a precision munition that was used later in an anti-tank weapon, but these are still basically just, you point the front of the helicopter and you'd shoot at somebody, and you could either walk the rounds in where you see the rounds hit and you walk them into your target, or you could bore sight and figure out essentially where the front of the helicopter was, and you just basically fired straight at your enemy. Now, a big challenge with that, Greg, was what did these not have? They were lightweight. No armor. First of all, no armor, and you get that big windscreen. So the guys are sitting right up front, in the front of this. The door gunners are exposed, so you had no armor. So the enemy realized very quickly they would form these boxes of anti-aircraft fire, and it could be small arms like rifles. It could be other things. They started to come up with some crude vehicles. What I mean by is a crude like dry vehicles, and they'd have 40 millimeter cannons, 20 millimeter cannons. They could have essentially heavy machine guns. These aircraft were very susceptible to ground fire. So that was, what was the Hog's job, the gunship's role? The gunship's role was essentially to either kill the enemy or get the enemy to put their head down. We've talked about that before. When people are shooting at you, what do? You put your head down, and that is where, I'm going to go ahead and put my little guy down here, Greg. That is where the slicks came in. Now, the slicks were really a couple of different options, and what they were is they were either medevac option, which they came in, and we talked about the H-34 did the same thing, which where a medevac came in and it would get wounded soldiers, because you remember you have that golden hour that you've got to get them to an aid station.
We got the same hairy situation when we dropped in to pick up wounded soldiers. It's typical of the Viet Cong mentality that they make a special effort to get us when we land on a medevac mission. In those tense moments when we're loading casualties aboard the chopper, we're perfect sitting ducks. So you can believe it when I tell you we don't waste any time, and we don't stand on ceremony about pitching in to help. Sometimes we've got to double as medics, too, when an aid man is busy elsewhere or when he needs assistance. Despite the danger, this is one of our most rewarding jobs. The fact that we can fly out a wounded man to a field hospital in a few hours, sometimes even minutes, has saved a lot of American lives.
Or they would carry troops, and they would come in, they would do what's called an LZ, right? Landing zone, and they would drop troops in and they would control an area. So that was the beginning of this whole air mobile concept, and that was come in, overwhelming force, control an area, use your aerial artillery to get the enemy to put their head down, drop in troops, go out and do search and destroy missions, which they did a great deal at that time. Now, how would they, you have the canopy. You're saying, well, you got the canopy. Greg, they would drop a thing called a daisy cutter, which is a huge bomb out of a C-130, which at that time was the largest non-nuclear weapon on the planet. And what it would do is it would flatten everything, and they would come in and land there. You could use conventional artillery to knock the canopy down and be able to get the helicopters in. But these would come in. They'd essentially be pretty much unarmed because they're either getting folks out of there or they're bringing troops in. But those were called the slicks. Now, did it work? Yes, it worked fairly well, but the casualty rate was very, very high. There were 3,305 American helicopters shot down in Vietnam. The crew losses were 1,074 pilots and 1,103 crew that were lost in these helicopters. So the crew casualties and the aircraft losses were fairly high. So that is going to lead me into my stage 2. Greg has had a poisoning incident the last 2 periods with this. Both were with fizz soda. So we're going to look at this. This is not fizz, so we've moved on from that. But this is just as frightening. This is always ask for Avery's. You got to get the label up there. This is swamp juice. And one of the terms going to Vietnam was you're going out into the swamp. So Greg has, this one makes me very nervous. This says, it's soda gusting. Soda gusting, Greg. And the totally gross soda is on the label. Thank you, Greg, for giving me this. I feel so good about it. There is no sell-by date. It pretty much does look like swamp juice. And so what we're going to salute today is all of these crews, either in Vietnam or since, that have been like gunship drivers and these slicks. These folks in these helicopters is what perfected the air mobile concept. I'm going to talk about all the way where it kind of culminated in, but this is where we really got serious about helicopters. And the experience that these air crews paid for was paid for in blood. It was paid for in combat, and those are the hardest lessons to learn, is these combat lessons. So with that, I'm going to salute all of these crews, and I have now taken my magnetic, non-magnetic can opener, and we're going to give a so disgusting, as it says on the label, soda a shot. Greg is looking on in anticipation. You know, again, not my choice, but after the last 2, which were just absolutely the rudest things I've ever drank, this is not bad, Greg. One more for those crews, and again, very hard lessons learned in the 1960s on these crews, but we salute you. All right, Greg, well, I'm going to chalk that up as a win for Fred. Fred won, Greg 56. But this design continued to evolve to the point where the Marines, by the way, Greg, are still using these, a twin turbine version of this that they call the Venom, the UH-1Y model, which gives you an idea of how many we've covered from B to Y. It's also known as the Venom or the Yankee. The Marines are still using these. They have four-bladed rotors. They have a tremendous amount of lift. And I was at an air show one time where one of them took off next to our C-47, and literally the C-47 I thought was going to take off with me in it because the amount of downwash from the prop was tremendous. They have continued to evolve these in quite an effective platform. But in the early 1960s is where this started. Now let's talk about these individual airframes for a second. This particular airframe is 638610 is the bureau number. It is a UH-1B. It is wearing the livery of the 335th Aviation Company or Aviation Battalion. These are the Cowboys and the Falcons. This Tiger Strike camo and this livery is actually what this aircraft had in theater. Now, the interesting thing about it is we have recreated this aircraft as faithfully as we could, down to one of the things, and I know, Greg, I'm going to get blowback on this, but I'm going to do it anyways. One of the things that was happening with these helicopters as they went in country was we've talked about weapons packages, and there's specific numbers and types of weapons packages that were going on these helicopters as they went in country. The reality was, and we've talked to a bunch of folks when we restored this one, that a lot of those packages were being manufactured custom for the helicopters in the Philippines and then sent sent to Vietnam because they just didn't exist. They didn't have anything to upgun the helicopters. So the package that's on this with the 2.75 rocket package and the M60s in the door with custom mounts represent this helicopter as a hog very, very early in the conflict. And then as they standardized the packages, when I was talking about my little friend here, the weapons packages on the helicopters became much more standardized as delivery and the mounts, and they started even getting even heavier artillery put on them with that grenade launcher, that grenade launcher, the 40 millimeter grenade launcher in the front. Now this particular airframe was never shot down. It did suffer damage in a number of engagements, and was actually, one of the interesting things about it was actually hit by a claymore, detonated claymore that went through the floor. When we restored this helicopter, we found the patches, if you can believe that, Greg, the military patches in the floor when it was repaired. The sad part about that is the co-pilot in that particular engagement was killed. And I'm going to talk about fatalities at the end of this, but this is one of the rare aircraft in our collection that there's actually a fatality associated with the airframe. In fact, both of these airframes, and this gives you an idea of how many people were lost, both of these aircraft had fatalities. And so this one, it continued to fly in Vietnam. It eventually went to the Seawolf program, which was loaned to the U.S. Navy, which they had gunships flying up and down the rivers, protecting the riverine forces. So I'm going to move on to the helicopter that is behind me to my left, and that is a UH-1H. The bureau number, serial number on it is 6717174. It's known as 174. This helicopter was actually shot down at Phu Lai in February 14th of 1969, which is difficult. And again, loss of life. We do know the two crew members that were lost. The crew chief was Gary Dubach, and the medic was Stephen Schumacher. I'm going to tell you why that's important in a minute. This particular aircraft was salvaged and came back. Now you'll notice this one has a very colorful livery. And that is because one of the things we talked about, we're in the Miles hangar, which represents a lot of Vietnam where we're filming this, a lot of the aircraft in here. When we started this, we decided that we were going to go out and get these relics. And one of the conversations that I had with an artist, a world-renowned artist, was Steve Maloney. And from that, he came up with a project called Take Me Home, Huey. And Take Me Home, Huey is a tribute to all of those helicopter crews that fought in Vietnam, and the two gentlemen that are fallen have fallen on this aircraft. He also has a thing as part of the site that it highlights post-traumatic stress for veterans. It is a fantastic site. Greg can throw it up on the screen, and I encourage you to go out and look at it. Steve Maloney has done just such a fantastic job, and the livery on this, I think, encompasses all of that era in Vietnam. Also, all of if Greg can get a tight shot of this, you can see all of the various helicopter companies and helicopter operating units that were in Vietnam at the time. So it is an amazing tribute. In the collection, there are very few artifacts, aircraft, that actually have loss of life associated with them. Both of these the two of these are that way. In the Warbird industry and the museum industry, the national museums will sometimes get essentially the pick of the litter on these aircraft, and there are aircraft in their inventory that have a historical significance from a loss of life. It is rare to see them in other museums. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important in a number of ways. One, if you run across one of these aircraft, treat them with respect, because somebody actually, gave up their life in this. This is a tribute to those people. And I do encourage you to go out to Take Me Home, Huey at Steve Maloney's site and see his vision and see what he's done with that. It is truly remarkable. Now, if you are interested in the Huey, I love the fabric on this one, Greg. This one is nice. You need your very own Huey shirt, right? You can have your very own Huey shirt. This is on the back. This is a really nice shirt and great color. You can tell they got the door guns in them, and you're getting ready to go in hot into that LZ. So get out to the website and pick yourself up one of these shirts. Now, a couple of final Fred fun facts. This UH-1B is a tribute aircraft. You'll see a plaque. If you come to the museum and the door is open on the one side, Gerhard Bayfeld was a special operations soldier. This is his family helped us get this helicopter, and this is a tribute to him. So the plaque is on the inside. And there's one other thing about this helicopter that's interesting. This was Sky Witness News in Orlando, Florida, Greg. But you can see the livery, and it says Sky Witness on the tail. But these helicopters, when they came back, they all had different lives. They lived on. So you can go out and find that, a little Fred fun fact there. I want to thank you for joining us today. Remember, hit that subscribe button, like us on YouTube, like us on Facebook. These two are very clear. These aircraft came out of parts piles, and these are examples of what we can do with your restoration dollars. So give us a donation, hit that donation page. I want to thank you very much for joining us. Have a great day.